In the shadowed halls of Blackthorn Manor, a scream pierces the night, and secrets unravel like threads from a tangled skein. Why does a priceless heirloom vanish, only to reappear in a chilling game of deceit? Who orchestrates a deadly dance of poison, locked rooms, and hidden passages? As guests turn on each other, Miss Jane Marple's quiet gaze cuts through the lies. Can she unmask a killer before the final trick claims another life? Step into a web of betrayal where every clue hides a darker truth. Chapter 1. The invitation to Blackthorn Manor. The late summer breeze carried a whisper of autumn as it rustled through the ivy-clad walls of St. Mary Mead's vicarage, where Miss Jane Marple sat knitting by her window. Her nimble fingers worked the needles with practiced ease, but her sharp eyes were fixed on a letter that lay open on the table beside her. The envelope bore the crest of Blackthorn Manor, a grand estate in the neighbouring village of Willoughby, and the handwriting was unmistakably that of Lady Beatrice Harrow, an old-school friend whose acquaintance had faded into polite Christmas cards over the years. The letter, however, was no mere courtesy. Its tone was urgent, almost pleading, inviting Miss Marple for a weekend gathering with a cryptic mention of troubling matters that required a discerning eye. Miss Marple set her knitting aside, her curiosity piqued. Beatrice had always been theatrical, but this was no flourish of drama. The words hinted at genuine unease. She packed a modest suitcase, her sensible woolens neatly folded, and arranged for her neighbour to tend her roses. By noon, she was aboard a rattling train bound for Willoughby, her mind already sifting through possibilities like a gardener turning soil. Blackthorn Manor loomed at the end of a winding lane, its grey stone facade softened by climbing roses but shadowed by ancient yews that seemed to guard secrets. As Miss Marple stepped from the hired car, the heavy oak door swung open, revealing Beatrice herself, her silver hair swept into an elegant chignon, though her smile was strained. "Jane, my dear, you've come," she exclaimed, clasping Miss Marple's hands. "I knew you wouldn't refuse an old friend. Trouble has a way of finding me, Beatrice." Miss Marple replied with a twinkle in her eye. "Or perhaps I have a way of finding it." Beatrice led her through a cavernous hall adorned with portraits of stern-faced Harrows, their eyes following the women as they ascended a creaking staircase. "It's the guests," Beatrice confided in a low voice. "They're an odd mix, and something's not right. I can't put my finger on it, but there's a shadow over this house." Miss Marple nodded, her mind noting the tremor in Beatrice's voice. They reached the drawing-room, where the guests were gathered for pre-dinner drinks. The room was a study in contrasts. Polished mahogany gleamed under a chandelier, but the air was thick with unspoken tension. Beatrice introduced the party with a practiced grace that did little to mask her unease. First was Clara Vane, a theatrical heiress whose auburn hair cascaded in waves and whose laughter rang a touch too loud. She wore an emerald green dress that shimmered like a peacock's tail, and her eyes darted about as if seeking an audience. "Miss Marple, is it?" Clara said, extending a gloved hand. "Beatrice says you're frightfully clever." "I adore clever people. They make life so much more interesting." Next was Colonel Reginald Thorpe, a retired military man with a bristling moustache and a penchant for polishing his monocle. His stiff posture suggested a man accustomed to command, yet his frequent glances toward the door betrayed a nervous edge. "Pleasure to meet you, ma'am," he said gruffly. "Heard you've a knack for puzzles. Hope you find this place less dull than I do." The third guest was Lionel Harrow, Beatrice's nephew, a lanky young man with a perpetually furrowed brow. His dark suit was impeccable, but his fingers toyed restlessly with a silver cigarette case. "Aunt Beatrice insists on these gatherings," he muttered, barely meeting Miss Marple's gaze. "Family duty, you know." Lastly, there was Elsie, the maid, a slight girl with mousy hair and eyes that seemed to see everything while revealing nothing. She moved silently, offering drinks with a deference that bordered on invisibility. Yet Miss Marple noted how her hands trembled slightly as she poured sherry for Clara. Dinner was served in the dining room, where candlelight cast flickering shadows on the damask walls. The conversation began pleasantly enough, with Beatrice recounting the manor's historia, tale of Elizabethan intrigue and a lost treasure rumoured to be hidden within its walls. Clara seized the topic with gusto, spinning a fantastical story of ghostly guardians, her voice rising theatrically. "Imagine it, a chest of gold guarded by a spectral knight," she exclaimed, her eyes gleaming. Colonel Thorpe snorted. "Nonsense. If there's treasure, it's long gone. This place is nothing but creaks and draughts." Lionel remained silent, his fork pushing peas around his plate, but Miss Marple caught him exchanging a glance with Elsie as she cleared the soup bowls. It was a fleeting moment, but it carried a weight she couldn't yet decipher, as the main course roast pheasant with a tart cranberry sauce was served. Beatrice steered the conversation to more recent matters. "There have been incidents," she said hesitantly. "Objects misplaced, doors left ajar, and last week, a window in the library was found shattered, though nothing was taken." "Probably village boys," Thorpe suggested, but his tone lacked conviction. "Or someone closer," Clara said with a sly smile, her gaze lingering on Lionel. He flushed, dropping his fork with a clatter. Miss Marple sipped her wine, her mind cataloguing each word and gesture. The tension was palpable, like a taut string waiting to snap. She was about to ask Beatrice for more details when a piercing scream shattered the air. Coming from the direction of the library, the guests froze, forks suspended, eyes wide. Beatrice leaped to her feet, her napkin fluttering to the floor. "What on earth?" she gasped, leading the charge down the hall. Miss Marple followed at a brisk pace, her sensible shoes tapping on the polished floor. The library was a grand room, its shelves lined with leather-bound volumes and its air heavy with the scent of old paper. A single lamp illuminated a large oak table where an open book lay, its pages fluttering as if touched by an unseen hand. The scream, it seemed, had come from Clara, who stood by the window, her hand pressed to her chest. "It was nothing, really," Clara said, her voice breathless but tinged with a theatrical flourish. "I saw a shadow outside and got carried away. Silly of me." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. The window was intact, the curtains undisturbed, and the garden beyond was shrouded. In darkness, she crossed to the table, her gaze falling on the open book. It was a treatise on toxicology, the page detailing the effects of belladonna, its inked illustration of the deadly plant stark against the yellowed paper. "An unusual choice of reading," she remarked lightly. Clara laughed, a brittle sound. "I was bored. Old books are so delightfully morbid, don't you think?" Beatrice, pale but composed, ushered everyone back to the dining room, insisting on dessert to calm nerves. Miss Marple lingered, her fingers brushing the book's spine. The scream had been too convenient, too perfectly timed to disrupt the conversation about the manor's troubles. She glanced at Lionel, who had remained silent during the commotion, his cigarette case now clutched tightly in his hand. His eyes met hers for a moment, and she saw a flicker of something, fear perhaps, or guilt. Back at the table, the mood was strained, the apple tart untouched by most. Colonel Thorpe launched into a monologue about his days in India, but his words felt forced, a shield against the evening's unease. Clara, meanwhile, regaled Elsie with questions about the manor staff, her tone probing yet playful. Elsie answered in monosyllables, her eyes darting to Beatrice as if seeking permission to speak. Miss Marple, ever observant, noted how Lionel avoided looking at the maid, though his fingers twitched as if longing to light a cigarette. Beatrice, too, seemed distracted, her gaze fixed on a portrait of her late husband, Sir Henry Harrow, whose stern features seemed to judge the room as coffee was served. Miss Marple decided to test the waters. "Clara dear," she said sweetly, "your scream was quite convincing. Have you considered a career on the stage?" Clara's smile faltered, then widened. "Oh, Miss Marple, you're too kind, but I assure you it was just a moment of nerves. This old house is full of shadows." "Shadows, indeed," Miss Marple murmured, her eyes scanning the room. She rose, excusing herself to fetch her shawl, but instead slipped back to the library. The book on toxicology was still open, but a faint pencil mark caught her circled passage about the plant's use in staged accidents. She closed the book, her mind racing, returning to the drawing room. She found the guests dispersing to their rooms, the evening's events having drained their spirits. Beatrice caught her arm. "Jane, was it really just a prank?" she whispered. Miss Marple patted her hand. "I believe Clara intended to unsettle us," she said softly, but Lionel's reaction was far more telling. "He knows something, Beatrice, and I intend to find out what." Beatrice nodded, her relief tinged with worry. "Be careful, Jane. This house, it holds more than shadows." As Miss Marple retired to her room, the manor seemed to settle around her, its creaks and sighs like whispers of secrets yet to be uncovered. Clara's scream had been a performance, a distraction from the real undercurrents of deceit. Lionel's unease, Elsie's silence, and Thorpe's bluster all pointed to a deeper mystery. The book on poisons was no coincidence, and Miss Marple knew the weekend had only begun to reveal its deadly tricks. Chapter 2. The Vanishing Cameo. The morning sun filtered through the heavy drapes of Blackthorn Manor, casting golden slants across the breakfast room where Miss Jane Marple sat, her teacup poised as she observed the assembled guests. The events of the previous evening, Clara, Vane's theatrical scream, and the unsettling discovery of the toxicology book lingered like a faint mist, though none spoke of it directly. Instead, the clink of silverware and the murmur of polite conversation filled the air. A fragile veneer over the manor's undercurrents of suspicion. Lady Beatrice Harrow presided over the table, her composure restored, but her eyes betraying a sleepless night. She wore a high-necked lavender dress, its simplicity at odds with the ornate dining room. Clara Vane, vibrant in a crimson blouse, recounted a London play she'd seen, her gestures animated but her laughter brittle. Colonel Reginald Thorpe, his monocle glinting, buttered his toast with military precision, while Lionel Harrow, Beatrice's nephew, stared into his coffee, his face pale and drawn. Elsie, the maid, moved silently, refilling teapots with a deference that made her nearly invisible, though Miss Marple noted the girl's quick glances toward Lionel. The meal was interrupted by a sharp gasp from Beatrice. She reached for her neck, her fingers searching for something that wasn't there. "My cameo brooch," she said, her voice trembling. "It's gone. I wore it last night, and now it's missing from my jewelry box." The room fell silent, Fawkes pausing mid-air. Clara's eyes widened with exaggerated concern. "Stolen? In this house? Oh, Beatrice, how dreadful." Colonel Thorpe cleared his throat. "Likely misplaced, Lady Harrow. These old houses have a way of swallowing things." Lionel's head snapped up, his voice sharp. "Or someone took it. That brooch is worth a fortune, family heirloom, isn't it, Aunt Beatrice?" Beatrice nodded, her face ashen. "It was my mother's, passed down for generations. I keep it in a locked box in my dressing room. Only the household has access." Suspicion flickered across the table, settling briefly on Elsie, who stood frozen with a teapot in hand. Her cheeks flushed, and she stammered, I didn't touch it, ma'am." "I swear." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind already at work. A missing heirloom was no small matter, especially in a house already fraught with unease. "Perhaps we should inspect the dressing room," she suggested mildly. "It may clarify things." Beatrice led the way to her private quarters, a spacious room adorned with rosewood furniture and a velvet-curtained window overlooking the garden. The jewelry box, an intricately carved mahogany piece, sat on a dressing table. Beatrice opened it with a small key, revealing velvet-lined compartments, all empty save for a pair of pearl earrings. "The cameo was here last night," she insisted. "I checked before dinner." Miss Marple examined the box, her fingers tracing its edges. A faint scratch marred the lock, barely noticeable unless one looked closely. "This lock hasn't been forced," she murmured, "but it's been handled recently." "Beatrice, who else has a key?" "No one," Beatrice replied. "It's always with me, on a chain around my neck." Clara, hovering near the door, clasped her hands dramatically. "A thief among us. It's like something out of a novel." "Perhaps a cat burglar scaled the walls." Thorpe snorted, adjusting his monocle. "Nonsense. No signs of a broken. It's an inside job, mark my words." His gaze lingered on Elsie, who shrank back, her hands twisting in her apron. Lionel, leaning against the doorframe, said nothing, but his eyes darted to the window, as if expecting to see the thief fleeing across the lawn. Miss Marple noted his unease, recalling his furtive glance at Elsie the previous night. There was a connection there, one she intended to unravel. "Let's not jump to conclusions," Miss Marple said, her tone soothing. "Beatrice, may I look?" Around the room, sometimes objects are misplaced in the bustle of a busy evening. Beatrice nodded, and Miss Marple began a methodical inspection, her sharp eyes scanning every detail. The dressing table held a silver hairbrush and a bottle of lavender water, undisturbed. The wardrobe revealed neatly hung dresses, but nothing amiss. As she approached a porcelain vase on a side table, adorned with painted roses, she paused. Its position seemed slightly off, as if it had been moved and not quite replaced. She lifted it, and a soft clink sounded from within. Reaching inside, her fingers closed around a small, cool object. She withdrew the cameo brooch, its ivory profile of a lady framed in gold, delicate and unmistakable. The room erupted in gasps. Beatrice clutched her chest. "Jane, you found it. But how?" "It was in the vase," Miss Marple said, holding the brooch up to the light. "An odd place for such a treasure, don't you think?" Elsie's eyes widened, her voice barely a whisper. "I didn't put it there, ma'am. I clean this room daily, but I never touched the vase." Clara clapped her hands. A mystery solved. "Miss Marple, you're a marvel. But who hid it, and why?" Thorpe's moustache twitched. Carelessness, most likely. People misplace things and forget. No need for dramatics. Lionel's jaw tightened, but he remained silent, his fingers tapping restlessly against his thigh. Miss Marple handed the brooch to Beatrice, who clasped it tightly, her relief palpable. "I'll keep it safer from now on," Beatrice said. "Thank you, Jane." The group returned to the breakfast room, but the mood had shifted. Suspicion lingered, unspoken but heavy. Miss Marple declined more tea, her mind sifting through the morning's events. The cameo's hiding place was no accident. It had been deliberately concealed, yet not stolen outright. Whoever placed it in the vase wanted it found, but only after sowing discord. The scratch on the jewelry box suggested someone had tested the lock, perhaps knowing it was kept on Beatrice's person. This was no theft, but a calculated act to unsettle the household. As the guests dispersed, Clara to the garden, Thorpe to the billiard room, and Lionel to his room with a muttered excuse. Miss Marple lingered with Beatrice. "Tell me about the brooch," she said softly. "Why is it so significant?" Beatrice sighed, settling into a chair. "It's not just its value, Jane. My mother believed it carried a blessing or a curse, depending on the wearer's heart. She said it revealed truth in its way. Silly, perhaps, but I've always cherished it." Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts turning to the guests. Clara's theatrics could mask a deeper motive, her flair for drama a perfect cover for manipulation. Thorpe's defensiveness hinted at secrets, perhaps tied to his past. Lionel's silence was troubling, his nervous energy suggesting knowledge he wasn't sharing. And Elsie, her quiet presence belied a keen awareness of the manor's dynamics. Seeking a moment alone, Miss Marple slipped into the conservatory, a glass-walled haven filled with ferns and orchids. She sat on a wicker bench, her knitting in her lap, though her needles remained still. The cameo's discovery had calmed the household, but it raised more questions than it answered. Why hide it in a vase, where a maid might easily find it? Why not take it and flee? The act felt personal, designed to rattle Beatrice and expose fault lines among the guests. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft footstep. Elsie appeared, carrying a tray of empty glasses from the morning's juice. She hesitated, then spoke in a low voice. "Miss Marple, I saw something last night, after the scream in the library. I didn't want to say in front of the others." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened, though her tone remained gentle. "Go on, my dear. What did you see?" Elsie glanced over her shoulder, as if fearing eavesdroppers. It was Mr. Lionel. He was in the hall near Lady Beatrice's room, holding something small in his hand. I couldn't see what, but he looked frightened. "He didn't see me." Miss Marple nodded, her mind fitting this new piece into the puzzle. "Thank you, Elsie. Best not to mention this to anyone else just yet." Elsie nodded and hurried away, leaving Miss Marple to her thoughts. Lionel's presence near Beatrice's room, combined with the cameo's odd hiding place, suggested he might know more than he let on. But was he the culprit or a pawn in someone else's game? As lunchtime approached, Miss Marple rejoined the guests in the dining room, where a cold spread of ham and salads awaited. Clara was regaling Thorpe with a tale of a lost necklace from her theatre days, her voice carrying a knowing edge. Thorpe listened with polite boredom while Lionel picked at his food, his eyes avoiding Miss Marple's. Beatrice, the cameo now pinned securely to her dress, seemed lighter, though her smiles were still cautious. Miss Marple decided to test the waters. "It's fortunate the brooch was found," she said brightly, "though I wonder why anyone would hide it in a vase." It's almost as if they wanted to cause a stir. Clara's fork paused, her smile tight. Some people thrive on chaos, don't they? It's practically an art form. Thorpe grunted. Or a mistake. People do foolish things under pressure. Lionel's hand trembled, spilling a drop of wine. He excused himself abruptly, muttering about a headache. Miss Marple watched him go, her suspicions deepening. The cameo's recovery had restored a fragile peace, but it was a distraction, a sleight of hand to mask a larger scheme. Someone in Blackthorn Manor was playing a dangerous game, and Miss Marple was determined to uncover their next move. Chapter 3. The Locked Room. Riddled the afternoon at Blackthorn Manor hung heavy with the promise of rain. The sky beyond the tall windows, a sullen grey. Miss Jane Marple sat in the drawing-room, her knitting needles clicking softly, though her attention was fixed on the guests. The recovery of Lady Beatrice Harrow's cameo brooch that morning had eased tensions, but an undercurrent of unease persisted, like a melody played just out of tune. Clara Vane, the theatrical heiress, lounged on a chaise, flipping through a fashion magazine with exaggerated nonchalance. Colonel Reginald Thorpe paced by the fireplace, his monocle glinting as he muttered about the damp weather. Lionel Harrow, Beatrice's nephew, was absent, having retreated to his room after lunch, his pallor and abrupt departure noted by Miss Marple's keen eye. Elsie, the maid, glided in with a tray of tea, her movements precise but her eyes wary, avoiding Miss Marple's gaze. Beatrice entered, her lavender dress now adorned with the recovered cameo, and announced a quiet evening ahead. No grand plans tonight, she said, forcing a smile. Just a simple supper and perhaps some cards. Her voice carried a hope for calm, but Miss Marple sensed her friend's lingering disquiet. A residue of the morning's theft and the previous night's scream. The group dispersed after tea, Clara to write letters, Thorpe to the billiard room, and Beatrice to her correspondence. Miss Marple, claiming a need for fresh air, stepped into the garden, where the scent of wet earth mingled with roses. She pondered Elsie's whispered revelation about Lionel near Beatrice's room and the peculiar hiding of the cameo in the vase. The acts seemed designed to unsettle, not to steal, suggesting a mind more intent on manipulation than profit. Her thoughts were interrupted by a sharp crack, like a whip snapping in the distance, echoing from the manor. She hurried back inside, her sensible shoes crunching on the gravel path. The sound had come from the west wing, where the study lay, a masculine room of dark wood and leather-bound ledgers. As she reached the hall, Beatrice and Clara were already there, their faces pale. Thorpe emerged from the billiard room, his cue still in hand. "What the devil was that?" he demanded. "It sounded like a gunshot," Clara said, her voice trembling but her eyes alight with a curious intensity, as if she were both frightened and thrilled. Beatrice led the way to the study, her steps quickening. The door was shut, the brass handle cold under her touch. She turned it, but it wouldn't budge. "It's locked," she gasped, rattling the knob. Thorpe pushed forward, shouldering the door, but it held fast. "Stand back," he barked, preparing to force it open, when Elsie appeared, her apron twisted in her hands. "The keys kept in the hall table," she said, fetching it with trembling fingers. Beatrice unlocked the door, and it swung inward with a groan. The sight within stopped them cold. Lionel Harrow lay slumped over the study desk, a revolver beside his limp hand, a crimson stain spreading across his shirt. The window was bolted, the curtains undisturbed, and no one else was in the room. A half-finished letter lay under his elbow, the ink still wet. and a glass of brandy sat untouched on the desk, its amber glow catching the lamplight. Clara stifled a scream, clutching Beatrice's arm. Thorpe swore under his breath, his monocle dropping to his chest. Elsie hovered in the doorway, her face ashen, a soft whimper escaping her lips. Miss Marple stepped forward, her expression calm but her eyes sharp, taking in every detail. The air smelled of gunpowder and wax polish, a stark contrast to the grim scene. Poor Lionel, Beatrice whispered, tears welling. Why would he? Thorpe cleared his throat. Looks like suicide, Lady Harrow. Tragic, but clear enough. The door was locked, window bolted. No one else could have been here. Miss Marple knelt beside the desk, careful not to disturb the scene. The revolver was an old service model, its grip worn but clean of fingerprints, save for Lionel's own, curled around it. The letter, addressed to Beatrice, read only, "I'm sorry, Aunt. I couldn't," before trailing off. She noted the brandy glass, its contents untouched, and a faint scratch on the door's lock, similar to the one on Beatrice's jewelry box. "Suicide, you say?" Miss Marple murmured, her tone mild but probing. "Yet the letter is unfinished, and the brandy untouched. A man intending to end his life might at least take a sip for courage." Clara's eyes narrowed, her voice sharp. "Are you suggesting murder? In a locked room?" "That's impossible." "Nothing is impossible, Miss Vane," Miss Marple replied, straightening. "Only improbable until understood." Beatrice, trembling, sent Elsie to telephone the police, who arrived within the hour. A local constable and a weary inspector named Hargrove. They examined the room, confirming the door had been locked from the inside and the window bolted, with no signs of forced entry. A clear case of suicide, Hargrove declared, noting Lionel's recent moodiness, as reported by Beatrice. The boy was troubled. "It happens." Miss Marple, however, was not convinced. She requested a moment to inspect the lock, and Hargrove, indulgent of the elderly lady, allowed it. She produced a small magnifying glass from her handbagger, habit from years of unraveling village mysteries, and studied the lock closely. The scratch was fresh. A thin line suggesting a tool, perhaps a wire, had been used to manipulate it. "Inspector," she said, "might I demonstrate something?" She took a hairpin from her bun, straightened it, and inserted it into the keyhole, twisting gently. With a soft click, the lock turned, then clicked back. A skilled hand could lock this door from the outside, making it appear secure from within. Hargrove's eyebrows rose. "You're saying someone tampered with it, but the window is bolted." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed. "But let's consider the room's other features." She crossed to the fireplace, where a faint draught stirred. The ashes. The chimney was narrow, but she noted a smudge of soot on the hearth, as if something had brushed against it. A small person, or one very agile, might use the chimney to exit, though it's unlikely. More likely, the answer lies in the lock itself. Clara, watching intently, folded her arms. "You're making this far too complicated, Miss Marple." Lionel was upset. Everyone saw it. He locked himself in and, "Well, you know." Thorpe nodded. "The lady's right. No need to invent conspiracies." The boy had troubles, perhaps debts or a broken heart. Beatrice, still clutching the cameo, shook her head. Lionel was reserved, but not desperate. He spoke of plans for the future just yesterday. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the letter. The handwriting was Lionel's, but the abrupt end suggested interruption, not despair. She turned to Elsie, who hovered near the door. "Elsie, did you see anyone near the study before the shot?" Elsie hesitated, her eyes flickering to Clara, then away. "No, ma'am. I was in the kitchen preparing supper." Miss Marple nodded, noting the girl's unease. The police, satisfied with their initial findings, removed Lionel's body and sealed the study, promising a full investigation. As they departed, Beatrice collapsed into a chair, her hands trembling. "Jane, was it really murder?" she whispered. "I believe so," Miss Marple said gently. "The locks scratch. The unfinished letter, they suggest someone staged this tragedy. But we must be patient. The truth has a way of revealing itself." The guests gathered for a somber supper, the absence of Lionel casting a pall over the table. Clara, unusually subdued, picked at her food, while Thorpe recounted a military tale of a locked room incident, his voice loud to fill the silence. Elsie served with mechanical precision, her eyes red-rimmed but her demeanour composed. Miss Marple, eating sparingly, observed the dynamics. Clara's earlier flair had dimmed, replaced by a calculated stillness. Thorpe's bluster seemed forced, his glances toward the study door betraying unease. Elsie's silence was telling, her brief hesitation when questioned suggesting she knew more than she'd admitted. After supper, Miss Marple excused herself to the library, where the toxicology book from the first night still lay. She flipped through it, finding no new clues but noting its presence as a deliberate hint, perhaps tied to the day's events. Returning to the drawing room, she found Beatrice alone, staring into the fire. "Jane, I can't bear this," Beatrice said. "First the cameo, now Lionel. What's happening in my house?" Miss Marple took her hand. "Someone is weaving a web, Beatrice, and Lionel's death is part of it. The locked room was meant to mislead, but it's given us a thread to follow. We'll find the truth, I promise." As she retired to her room, the manor's creaks seemed to echo the day's grim discovery. The locks scratch, the untouched brandy, and Elsie's fleeting glance all pointed to a carefully orchestrated crime. Someone had wanted Lionel dead, and the locked room was their sleight of hand. Miss Marple knew the next move would be bolder, and she was ready to meet it with her quiet, unyielding resolve. Chapter 4. The Poisoned Teacup. The air in Blackthorn Manor was thick with grief and suspicion as the afternoon sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the lawn. Miss Jane Marple sat in the conservatory, her knitting untouched, her sharp eyes scanning the garden through the glass walls. The locked room murder of Lionel Harrow the previous evening had left the household reeling, and the police's tentative conclusion of suicide did little to quell the unease. Miss Marple's demonstration with the hairpin had planted doubts, and she sensed the killer was still among them, watching, waiting for their next move. Lady Beatrice Harrow, pale but resolute, had insisted on maintaining routine, and so the guests gathered for afternoon tea in the drawing room. The silver tea service gleamed under the chandelier, a stark contrast to the sombre mood. Clara Vane, the theatrical heiress, wore a subdued navy dress, her usual flamboyance tempered by the day's tragedy. Colonel Reginald Thorpe sat stiffly, his monocle polished to a fault, his fingers drumming on the arm of his chair. Elsie, the maid, moved with quiet efficiency, setting out delicate porcelain cups and a plate of scones, though her hands trembled as she poured the tea. Beatrice, the cameo brooch pinned securely to her blouse, attempted to steer the conversation to neutral ground. Speaking of the village fete next month, Miss Marple, sipping her tea, observed the group with her usual quiet intensity. Clara's subdued demeanour seemed calculated, her eyes darting to Thorpe as if gauging his mood. Thorpe's restlessness suggested discomfort beyond grief, and Elsie's nervous glances toward the door hinted at secrets unspoken. The memory of Lionel's body, slumped in the study, lingered like a ghost, and Miss Marple knew the killer was playing a dangerous game, each act more brazen than the last. As Elsie offered Thorpe a second cup, he raised it to his lips, then froze, his face contorting. The cup slipped from his hand, shattering on the parquet floor, and he clutched his throat, gasping. Clara screamed, leaping to her feet, while Beatrice dropped her scone, her eyes wide with horror. Miss Marple, with a speed that belied her age, darted forward, knocking the teapot from Elsie's hands before she could pour more. "Don't drink," she cried, her voice sharp. No one touched the tea. Thorpe coughed violently, his face red but his breathing steadying. "What the devil?" he rasped, collapsing back into his chair. Elsie stood frozen, the spilled tea pooling at her feet, her expression a mix of fear and confusion. Beatrice, trembling, knelt beside Thorpe. "Reginald, are you all right?" "What happened?" "Felt like fire in my throat," he muttered, loosening his collar. "Something in the tea." Miss Marple knelt by the shattered cup, careful not to touch the liquid. The faint, acrid scent was unmistakable, not the bergamot of Earl Grey, but something sharper, chemical. "Arsenic, I suspect," she said softly, her mind racing. "We must call a doctor and the police. Elsie, fetch a glass jar and carefully collect a sample of the tea from the floor." Elsie nodded, her hands shaking as she hurried to comply. Clara, her composure cracking, wrung her hands. "Poison in the tea. But we all could have drunk it." Her voice rose, theatrical but tinged with genuine fear. Beatrice's face was ashen. "Jane, how did this happen? First Lionel, now this." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. Someone meant harm, but not necessarily to the Colonel. The teapot was shed, any of us could have been the target. She glanced at Clara, whose untouched cup sat on the table, its contents pristine. "Miss Vane, you didn't drink your tea." "Why not?" Clara flushed, her fingers twisting a handkerchief. I prefer coffee in the afternoon. Tea upsets my stomach." Her explanation was smooth, but her eyes flickered with unease. Thorpe, recovering, glared at Elsie as she returned with the jar. "The maid poured it. She's the one to question." Elsie's eyes filled with tears. "I didn't do anything, sir. I brewed the tea, as always, in the kitchen." "I swear it." Miss Marple raised a hand, her tone calming. "No accusations yet, Colonel. Let's consider the facts." She instructed Elsie to lock the remaining tea and the jarred sample in the pantry, away from tampering, and sent for the village doctor, Dr. Merton, who arrived promptly with Inspector Hargrove in tow. Dr. Merton examined Thorpe, declaring him shaken but unharmed, likely due to the small sip he'd taken. The tea sample was sent for analysis, but Miss Marple's mention of arsenic prompted Hargrove to take the incident seriously. "If it's poison, we're dealing with a dangerous mind," he said, eyeing the guests, who had access to the tea before it was served. Elsie, trembling under scrutiny, explained that she'd prepared the tea in the kitchen, using leaves from a tin kept in a locked cupboard. "Only cook and I have the key," she said. "No one else was there." Miss Marple, however, was already piecing together a different picture. "May I see the garden?" she asked Beatrice. "Some plants can be quite revealing." Beatrice, puzzled but trusting, led the way to the walled garden, where herbs and flowers grew in neat rows. Miss Marple, with Hargrove and the guests, trailing behind, examined the beds, her eyes settling on a cluster of innocuous-looking plants with small, white flowers. "Arsenic can be derived from certain compounds," she said, "but these are tansy plants, often mistaken for harmless herbs. Their leaves, if steeped, can mimic arsenic's effects in small doses." Clara's face paled, her voice sharp. "Are you saying someone used the garden to poison us?" "That's absurd." "Not absurd, Miss Vane," Miss Marple replied. "Merely deliberate. Tansy is a known herbal remedy, but in excess it's toxic. Someone with knowledge of plants could have used it." Her gaze lingered on Clara, who had boasted of her herbal studies during a previous conversation. Clara bristled. "I know herbs, yes, but I'd never poison anyone. I'm an actress, not a chemist." Thorpe, still pale, grunted. "Someone did, and I nearly paid the price. This house is cursed." Beatrice clutched her cameo, her voice breaking. "First my brooch, then Lionel, now this. Jane, what does it mean?" Miss Marple patted her arm. "It means someone is testing us, Beatrice. The poison was a distraction, meant to sow fear and shift suspicion." She turned to Hargrove. "Inspector, I suggest you question the kitchen staff, but also check the tin of tea leaves. It's possible the tansy was added there, not in the pot." Hargrove nodded, dispatching a constable to the kitchen. The guests returned to the drawing room, where the atmosphere was brittle, each glance laden with accusation. Clara, regaining her poise, began a monologue about a poisoned chalice in a play she'd performed, her words filling the silence but doing little to ease the tension. Thorpe, nursing a glass of water, muttered about security, while Elsie hovered, her eyes darting between the guests as if expecting another disaster. Miss Marple, seated by the window, considered the day's events. The poison was a bold move, yet calculated. The dose was small, enough to frighten but not to kill. Clara's untouched tea was suspicious, but her knowledge of herbs made her an obvious suspect, perhaps too obvious. Thorpe's quick recovery suggested he wasn't the true target, and Elsie's access to the tea made her vulnerable to blame, yet her fear seemed genuine. The killer was orchestrating chaos, each act designed to obscure their motive. Seeking a moment of clarity, Miss Marple excused herself to the library, where the toxicology book from the first night still lay. She flipped through its pages, finding a section on tansy, its effects eerily similar to Thorpe's symptoms. A faint pencil mark underlined a passage about its use in staged accidents, echoing the book's earlier clue about belladonna. Someone was leaving breadcrumbs, but whether to taunt or mislead, she couldn't yet say. Returning to the drawing room, she found Beatrice alone, the others having retired to their rooms. "Jane, I'm frightened," Beatrice confessed, her hands clasped tightly. "This house feels like a trap." Miss Marple took her hand, her voice steady. "It's not the house, Beatrice, but someone within it. The poison was meant to distract, to make us suspect each other. But it's also a mistake, their first real misstep." Beatrice's eyes widened. "You think you know who did it?" "Not yet," Miss Marple said, "but the pieces are falling into place. The tea, like the cameo and Lionel's death, is part of a pattern. We must watch closely tomorrow." As she climbed the stairs to her room, the manor's shadows seemed to pulse with secrets. The poisoned tea had been a warning, not a fatal blow, and Miss Marple knew the killer was growing bolder. Clara's herbal knowledge, Thorpe's defensiveness, and Elsie's silences all held clues, but the true motive lay just out of reach. With the police now alert and the guests on edge, the stage was set for the killer's next act, and Miss Marple was determined to be one step ahead. Chapter 5. The Midnight Masquerade. The evening at Blackthorn Manor was cloaked in an uneasy calm, the weight of recent events pressing heavily on its inhabitants. Miss Jane Marple sat by her bedroom window, her knitting idle in her lap as she gazed at the moonlit garden below. The poison tea incident that afternoon had left Colonel Thorpe shaken but unharmed, and the police's confirmation of Tansy in the tea leaves had deepened the household's distrust. Lionel Harrow's murder, the vanishing cameo, and now the poison tea formed a chilling pattern, one Miss Marple was determined to unravel. Each act seemed designed to sow chaos, yet the killer's true motive remained elusive, hidden behind a veil of misdirection. Lady Beatrice Harrow, desperate to restore some semblance of normalcy, had announced a masquerade ball for the evening, a tradition her late husband had loved. "It's what Henry would have wanted," she'd said at breakfast, her voice firm despite the tremor in her hands. "A night to lift our spirits." Miss Marple had noted the forced cheer, but agreed to join, sensing the event might flush out new clues in the charged atmosphere. The ballroom was a vision of faded grandeur, its crystal chandeliers casting prisms of light across polished floors. Guests donned masks and costumes from Beatrice's collection, transforming the somber group into a tableau of silk and feathers. Clara Vane, resplendent in a scarlet domino mask and a flowing Venetian gown, glided through the room, her laughter bright but brittle. Colonel Thorpe, in a black half-mask and a military-style cape, stood stiffly by the punch bowl, his monocle replaced by a wary squint. Beatrice, dressed as a Regency lady with a silver mask, welcomed the small gathering of local gentry invited to bolster the event. Elsie, the maid, moved among them, serving drinks in a simple black dress and a plain mask that did little to hide her nervous glances. Miss Marple, in a modest lavender gown and a lace mask borrowed from Beatrice, blended into the background, her sharp eyes missing nothing. The music, a lively waltz from a gramophone, filled the air, but the dancers' steps lacked joy, their movements shadowed by the manor's recent tragedies. She noted Clara's animated conversation with a local squire, her gestures exaggerated, as if performing for an unseen audience. Thorpe, meanwhile, kept close to Beatrice, his posture protective yet tense, his eyes scanning the room as the clock struck 11. Miss Marple felt a light touch on her arm. A masked figure in a dark cloak slipped a folded note into her hand, and vanished into the crowd before she could speak. She unfolded it carefully, her heart quickening at the scrawled words, "Leave, or you'll be next." The handwriting was hurried, the ink smudged, but the threat was clear. She tucked the note into her reticule, her mind racing. The warning was bold, yet it suggested the killer feared her scrutiny a sign she was closer to the truth than she'd realized. She scanned the room, searching for the cloaked figure, but the swirling masks made identification impossible. Instead, she approached Beatrice, who was adjusting her mask near the fireplace. "Beatrice, dear," Miss Marple said softly, "have you noticed anyone acting oddly tonight?" Beatrice frowned, her eyes darting to Clara, who was now waltzing with a young man from the village. "Clara's been overly cheerful, but that's her way. And Reginald Colonel Thorpe's seems on edge, more than usual. I thought the ball would help, but it feels wrong." Miss Marple nodded, her gaze settling on Elsie, who was refilling a tray of glasses. The maid's movements were precise, but her eyes flicked toward a corner where a tall figure in a harlequin mask lingered, speaking to no one. Miss Marple made her way over, her steps unhurried, and engaged the figure in small talk about the weather. The voice a man's, low and guarded, offered little, and he excused himself quickly, melting into the crowd as the music shifted to a slower tune. Miss Marple noticed a torn glove on the floor near the punch bowl, its black silk edged with silver thread. It matched the style worn by Lionel's fiancée, Margaret Lyle, who had arrived that morning to mourn her betrothed. Margaret, in a sapphire gown and a feathered mask, stood alone by a window, her posture rigid. Miss Marple approached, her tone gentle. "Miss Lyle, you seem troubled. Is there anything I can help with?" Margaret's mask hid her expression, but her voice was tight. "It's just, being here, where Lionel died, it's too much." Her gloved hand intact clutched a fan, but Miss Marple noted the absence of the silver-edged glove she'd worn earlier. Returning to the punch bowl, Miss Marple retrieved the torn glove, her mind connecting it to the threatening note. The glove's owner had been careless, and the note's delivery suggested panic. She decided to test her theory. As the ball reached its peak, she slipped upstairs to Margaret's room, which Beatrice had pointed out earlier. The door was unlocked, and inside, a quick search revealed a pair of silver-edged gloves in a drawer, one missing. A scrap of paper in the wastebasket bore a single word in the same hurried script as the note: "Leave." Miss Marple returned to the ballroom, her suspicions confirmed but her approach cautious. Confronting Margaret publicly would be unwise. The young woman was grieving, and fear might drive her to silence. Instead, she sought her out as the guests began to disperse. Finding her in the garden, her mask removed, her face pale under the moonlight. "Miss Lyle," Miss Marple said gently, holding up the torn glove. "This is yours, I believe. And this note, slipped to me tonight, carries your handwriting. Why did you warn me to leave?" Margaret's eyes widened, her breath catching. I didn't mean harm, Miss Marple. I'm frightened. Last night, I overheard someone in the hall whispering about getting rid of you. I didn't see who, but they mentioned the study and poison. I thought if I scared you away, you'd be safe." Miss Marple's expression softened, though her mind was alert. "Who was it, Margaret? Did you recognize the voice?" Margaret shook her head, tears spilling. "It was too low, too muffled. I only heard fragments. She's too close. And the plan? I wrote the note to protect you, I swear." Miss Marple patted her hand. "Thank you, my dear. You've done the right thing by telling me. Say nothing to the others, and keep your door locked tonight." As Margaret nodded and hurried inside, Miss Marple remained in the garden, the note heavy in her reticule. The warning was a crack in the killer's armor, proof they feared her interference. Margaret's story rang true, but her proximity to Lionel's death and her presence near the study made her a figure to watch. The glove and note resolved one thread. The threat against Herbert opened a new question. Who had whispered in the hall, and what was the plan? Back in the ballroom, the gramophone had stopped, and the remaining guests were bidding good night. Clara, her mask dangling from her hand, laughed too loudly at a squire's jest, while Thorpe stood by Beatrice, his cape askew, his eyes scanning the room as if expecting an attack. Elsie cleared glasses, her movements slow, her face drawn. Miss Marple caught her eye, noting a flicker of relief, as if the maid sensed the night had passed without further incident. Beatrice approached, her silver mask now in her hand. "Jane, did you enjoy the ball? I hoped it would lift spirits, but it feels hollow." "It was illuminating," Miss Marple replied, her tone light but her mind heavy with the night's discoveries. The masks hid faces, but not intentions. "We're closer to the truth, Beatrice." As she retired to her room, the manor's silence was broken only by the creak of floorboards and the distant howl of wind. The threatening note, Margaret's confession, and the whispered plot pointed to a killer growing desperate. Clara's forced cheer, Thorpe's vigilance, and Elsie's quiet observance all held pieces of the puzzle. But the heart of the mystery, Lionel's murder and its connection to the cameo and the poison, remained just out of reach. Miss Marple locked her door, her resolve unshaken. The masquerade had revealed more than its sender intended, and she was ready for the killer's next move. Chapter 6. The Hidden Passage. The morning after the masquerade ball at Blackthorn Manor dawned grey and heavy, the air thick with the scent of impending rain. Miss Jane Marple sat in the conservatory, her knitting a mere prop as her sharp mind sifted through the events of the past days. Clara's scream in the library, the stolen cameo, Lionel's locked room murder, the poisoned tea, and the threatening note slipped to her during the ball. Margaret Lyle's confession that she'd overheard a whispered plot against Miss Marple had confirmed the killer's growing unease, but the motive behind these acts remained shrouded. Like the mist clinging to the manor's gardens, Lady Beatrice Harrow, determined to keep the household together, had invited the guests to join her for a late breakfast, but the mood was strained. Clara Vane, in a pale yellow dress that seemed too bright for the occasion, picked at her fruit with a distracted air, her usual theatrics subdued. Colonel Reginald Thorpe, his military bearing intact despite his brush with poison, sipped coffee with a scowl, his monocle catching the dim light. Margaret Lyle, Lionel's fiancée, sat quietly, her sapphire gown replaced by sombre grey, her eyes red from grief or sleeplessness. Elsie, the maid, served with her usual deference, but Miss Marple noted the girl's quick glances toward the door, as if expecting an interruption. Beatrice, her cameo pinned securely, attempted to lighten the mood with talk of the manor's history, but her words faltered. "This house has seen its share of secrets," she said, her voice soft, "but never like this." Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts turning to the manor itself. Old houses, she knew, held more than memories, they held hiding places. The threatening note, coupled with Margaret's tale of whispered plans, suggested the killer moved with confidence, perhaps using the manor's layout to their advantage. She resolved to explore, sensing the key to the mystery might lie in the house's very bones. After breakfast, while the others scattered, Clara to the drawing room, Thorpe to the terrace, and Margaret to her room, Miss Marple slipped into the library, where the toxicology book had first caught her attention. The room was silent, its shelves towering like sentinels. She ran her fingers along the bookcases, her village instincts guiding her to look beyond the obvious. Near the fireplace, a panel of oak seemed slightly misaligned, its grain interrupted by a hairline crack. She pressed gently, and with a soft click, the panel swung inward, revealing a narrow passage, its air cool and musty. Miss Marple hesitated, then fetched a small torch from her handbag, a habit from her St. Mary Mead days, when nosy neighbours and dark attics often required investigation. The passage was cramped, its stone walls damp, and it sloped upward, ending at a wooden door. She pushed it open, stepping into a dusty attic filled with trunks and cobwebs. The faint light from a high window illuminated a stack of yellowed letters, tied with ribbon, resting on a crate. She untied the bundle, her eyes scanning the faded ink. The letters, dated decades ago, were from Beatrice's late husband, Sir Henry Harrow, to a woman named Eleanor, hinting at a scandalous affair and a disputed inheritance. One letter mentioned a true heir excluded from the family fortune, a revelation that sent a shiver through Miss Marple. The final letter, dated just before Henry's death, spoke of hiding proof in the manor to protect the family name. A fresh footprint in the duster man's boot, by its size, caught her eye, suggesting someone had visited recently. Miss Marple tucked a letter into her reticule, intending to share it with Beatrice, and retraced her steps, securing the passage. Behind her, the discovery was significant. The attic held secrets tied to the Harrow family, and the footprint suggested the killer knew of them. She found Beatrice in the morning room, reviewing household accounts, her face drawn. "Beatrice," "Dear Miss Marple," said, producing the letter. "I found a hidden passage in the library, leading to an attic with these letters. They speak of an inheritance, dispute, and a hidden heir. Does this mean anything to you?" Beatrice's eyes widened as she read, her hands trembling. "Eleanor, my husband's cousin. There were rumors of an affair, but I never knew about a child. Henry was secretive about his will, but I thought it was settled." She paused, her voice breaking. "Could this be why all this is happening?" Miss Marple nodded. "It's possible. The footprint in the attic suggests someone else knows of these letters. We must keep this quiet until we understand more." Beatrice agreed, her relief at sharing the secret tempered by fear. "I'll lock the library tonight, Jane. Thank you for finding this. It's a start." As they spoke, Clara entered, her yellow dress a stark contrast to the room's muted tones. "What's this about secrets?" she asked, her tone playful but her eyes sharp. "You two look positively conspiratorial." Miss Marple smiled benignly. "Just discussing the manor's history, Miss Vane. Old houses are full of surprises." Clara laughed, but her gaze lingered on Beatrice's troubled expression. "Well, I hope they're pleasant ones. This place could use some cheer." She flounced out, leaving a trace of jasmine perfume in her wake. Miss Marple excused herself, her mind turning to the footprint. Its size ruled out Elsie and likely Clara, but Thorpe's heavy tread or even a local intruder could fit. Margaret, too, was a possibility, though her grief seemed genuine. The passage itself was a revelation, a means by which the killer could move unseen, perhaps explaining the locked room murder or the cameo's hiding place. She decided to observe the guests more closely. At lunch, served in the dining room under the stern gaze of Harrow portraits, the atmosphere was tense. Thorpe, recounting a campaign in Burma, seemed overly loud, his anecdotes a shield against scrutiny. Margaret ate little, her eyes fixed on her plate, while Clara steered the conversation to the ball, her laughter ringing hollow. Elsie, serving soup, moved with a quiet intensity, her earlier nervousness replaced by a strange calm. Miss Marple, eating sparingly, tested the waters. "This manor has such character," she said brightly. "I wonder if it has any secret passages, like in old novels. They're often used for unexpected purposes." Thorpe's spoon paused, his eyes narrowing. "Passages. Load of nonsense. This isn't a Gothic tale." Clara leaned forward, intrigued. "Oh, I'd love a secret passage. Imagine the dramas, sneaking about, hiding treasures." Her tone was light, but her fingers tightened on a napkin. Margaret's head snapped up, her voice soft but sharp. "Some secrets are best left buried. This house has too many already." Miss Marple noted the reactions, her suspicions deepening. The passage's existence was a card she'd played carefully, and the responses told her someone was rattled. After lunch, she slipped back to the library, ensuring the panel was secure, and joined Beatrice in the garden, where the air was fresher but no less charged. "Jane, what do we do now?" Beatrice asked, her cameo glinting in the weak sunlight. "These letters, they change everything." "We watch and wait," Miss Marple said. "The passage is a key, and someone has used it recently. The killer is close, Beatrice, and they're growing careless." As evening approached, the guests gathered for a quiet dinner. The absence of music or festivity, a stark contrast to the previous night's ball. Clara, regaining her flair, proposed a game of charades, but no one took up the suggestion. Thorpe retired early, claiming a headache, while Margaret excused herself to write letters. Elsie cleared the table, her movements swift, and Miss Marple caught her eye. Offering a reassuring nod, alone with Beatrice, Miss Marple shared her thoughts. The passage explains much how the cameo was hidden, perhaps how Lionel's killer escaped. The letters point to a motive tied to the past, but we need more to unmask the culprit. Beatrice clutched her hands. "I trust you, Jane. This house feels alive with malice, but your presence gives me hope." As Miss Marple retired, the manor's shadows seemed to whisper of the attic's secrets. The hidden passage was a breakthrough, its footprint a clue to the killer's identity. Clara's curiosity, Thorpe's defensiveness, Margaret's cryptic warning, and Elsie's quiet watchfulness all wove into the mystery. The letters had opened a door to the past, but the present danger was clear, and Miss Marple knew the next act would bring her closer to the truth. Chapter 7. The stolen Wilther morning light filtered through the tall windows of Blackthorn Manor, doing little to dispel the chill that had settled over the household. Miss Jane Marple sat in the morning room, her knitting a quiet rhythm as she reflected on the mounting mysteries. Clara's scream, the vanished cameo, Lionel's locked room murder, the poisoned tea, the threatening note at the masquerade, and the hidden passage with its revealing letters. The attic discovery had pointed to a scandalous inheritance dispute, a thread tying the past to the present chaos. Someone in the manor was orchestrating these events, and Miss Marple sensed they were closing in on a critical moment, their desperation growing with each uncovered clue. Lady Beatrice Harrow entered, her face drawn but resolute, the cameo brooch pinned to her navy dress like a talisman. She sank into a chair, her hands clasped tightly. "Jane, I can't shake the feeling that this house is turning against us," she said, her voice low. "After those letters you found, I've been thinking about Henry's will. It's been locked in the safe since his death, but I haven't looked at it in years." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "A will, you say? Perhaps it's time to check it, Beatrice. Old documents can stir up old grudges." Beatrice nodded, leading Miss Marple to the study, where Lionel's body had been found only days before. The room was now unsealed, though the air still held a faint trace of gunpowder. A heavy iron safe stood in the corner, its dial gleaming under the lamplight. Beatrice knelt, her fingers trembling as she turned the combination, a sequence only. She knew. The door swung open, revealing a velvet-lined interior, but her gasp shattered the silence. "It's gone," she whispered, her hands searching the empty compartment. "Henry's will, it's not here." Miss Marple knelt beside her, examining the safe. The lock was intact, but a faint scratch marred its edge, similar to those on the library door and Beatrice's jewellery box. Forced, but cleverly, she murmured. Someone knew what they were looking for. The guests were summoned to the drawing room, where Beatrice announced the theft, her voice trembling with indignation. Clara Vane, in a lilac dress that seemed too cheerful for the occasion, clutched her throat dramatically. A stolen will. This is like a play by Webster. Who would dare? Colonel Reginald Thorpe, his monocle glinting, snorted. Thieves, that's who. This house is a magnet for trouble. His gaze settled on Margaret Lyle, Lionel's fiancée, who stood by the window, her grey dress blending with the overcast light. You were close to Lionel, Thorpe said sharply. He might have known about the will, told you where it was. Margaret's face flushed, her voice tight. I knew nothing of any will. Lionel never spoke of it. Why accuse me? Her hands twisted in her lap, her grief palpable but her defensiveness noted by Miss Marple. Elsie, the maid, hovered near the door, her eyes wide. I never went near the safe, ma'am, she said, unprompted, her voice quavering. I clean the study, but I don't touch anything. Miss Marple, seated by the fireplace, observed the room's dynamics. Clara's theatrics masked a keen interest. Thorpe's accusation was too quick, and Margaret's reaction suggested fear as much as grief. The theft of the will, following so closely on the attic letters, pointed to a motive rooted in the Harrow family's past inheritance someone was desperate to claim or conceal. Beatrice, Miss Marple said gently, tell us about the will. What did it contain? Beatrice hesitated, her fingers brushing the cameo. Henry left most of his estate to me, but there was a provision for a distant relative, someone he never named. He said it was to right an old wrong. I thought it a formality, there was no one to claim it. Clara leaned forward, her eyes gleaming, a mysterious air. How thrilling. Perhaps they're among us, plotting to steal their due. Thorpe's mustache twitched. Or someone wants to destroy it to keep the fortune intact. Greed's a powerful motive. Margaret's voice cut through, sharp and low. Stop it, all of you. Lionel's dead, and you're squabbling over money. It's indecent, she stormed. Out, her footsteps echoing in the hall. Miss Marple's mind raced. The will's theft was no random act, it was tied to the letter's revelation of a hidden heir. The safe's scratch suggested the same skilled hand that had manipulated the study lock and the jewelry box. She requested to examine the study again, and Beatrice agreed, leading her back with Inspector Hargrove, who had been called to investigate the theft. The study was as they'd left it, the desk now cleared of Lionel's tragic remnants. Miss Marple examined the safe closely, noting the absence of fingerprints, even Beatrice's, suggesting it had been wiped clean. The thief wore gloves, she said, her tone matter-of-fact, perhaps from the masquerade, where such accessories were common. Hargrove raised an eyebrow. You think the ball was a cover for this? Bold, if true. Not a cover, Miss Marple replied, but an opportunity. The chaos of the evening allowed movement unnoticed. She recalled the torn glove from the ball, linked to Margaret, but its silver thread didn't match the plain gloves likely used here. The killer was meticulous, covering their tracks with care. Leaving the study, Miss Marple wandered to the library, her thoughts on the hidden passage. Could the thief have used it to access the study unseen? She checked the panel, finding it secure, but a faint scuff on the floor suggested recent use. She decided to keep this to herself, wary of tipping her hand. At lunch, the atmosphere was brittle, the guests barely touching the cold meats and salads. Clara, regaining her flair, speculated about the will's contents, her voice carrying a teasing edge. Perhaps it names a long-lost cousin, living in squalor, ready to claim the manor. Thorpe grunted, his eyes on Margaret, who had returned, her face composed but pale. Or someone closer, looking to secure their future. Lionel's death might have been the first step. Margaret's fork clattered. Your vile Colonel. Lionel loved his aunt. He'd never steal from her. Miss Marple, eating sparingly, steered the conversation. The will's absence suggests someone fears its contents. Beatrice, was anyone else aware of its provisions? Beatrice shook her head. Only Lionel, and even he knew little. Henry was private about such matters. The mention of Lionel brought a hush, and Elsie, clearing plates, dropped a glass, her apology barely audible. Miss Marple noted her distress, wondering if the maid knew more than she let on. After lunch, Miss Marple requested a private word with Hargrove, sharing her suspicion about the passage. It's possible the thief used it to move undetected, she said. The footprint I found suggests a man, but we mustn't rule out accomplices. Hargrove, impressed by her acumen, agreed to search the passage, but found no new clues, only the same footprint. It's a start, he said, but we need the will itself to prove anything. Miss Marple's next move was to observe the guests. She found Clara in the drawing room, sketching a portrait of Beatrice with an intensity that belied her carefree demeanour. You're quite the artist, Miss Marple said, peering at the drawing. Clara smiled, her pencil pausing. It's a hobby, captures the soul, don't you think? Beatrice's is so burdened. Miss Marple nodded, noting the sketch's detail, the cameo rendered with precision, as if Clara knew its significance. She then sought Thorpe on the terrace, where he smoked a cigar, his eyes scanning the horizon. Colonel, you seem troubled, she said mildly. Is it the will? Thorpe exhaled sharply. This house is a powder keg, Miss Marple. I've seen men turn on each other for less than a fortune. Whoever took that will has blood on their hands. His words, though blunt, carried a hint of fear, and Miss Marple filed it away. Margaret, found in the garden, was less forthcoming, her grief a shield. I just want to leave, she whispered. This place is cursed. As evening approached, Miss Marple joined Beatrice in the morning room, where a fire crackled. Jane. I'm at my wit's end, Beatrice said. First Lionel, now the will. What's next? Miss Marple's thoughts were interrupted by a shout from the hall. Hargrove burst in, holding a folded document. Found it in the Colonel's luggage, he said, his voice grim, hidden in a cigar case. Thorpe, summoned, turned red with fury. Planted, I tell you. I've never seen that will in my life. Miss Marple examined the document, its wax seal intact, but the paper slightly creased, as if hastily handled. It's the will, Beatrice confirmed, her voice shaking. But why in Reginald's case? A frame, Miss Marple said softly. The thief wanted it found, to shift suspicion. The real culprit is watching us now. Hargrove took Thorpe for questioning, but Miss Marple believed his denial. The will's recovery was too convenient, a distraction from the true motive. As she retired, the manor's shadows seemed to pulse with intent. The stolen will, like the passage and the poison, was a piece of a larger puzzle, and Miss Marple knew the killer was circling, their next move imminent. Chapter 8. The Final Deception. The twilight at Blackthorn Manor was heavy with the weight of secrets. The air charged, as if a storm were brewing within its walls. Miss Jane Marple stood by the drawing-room window, her knitting folded neatly in her lap, her mind weaving together the threads of the past days. Clara's theatrical scream, the stolen cameo, Lionel's locked room murder, the poisoned tea, the threatening note, the hidden passage, and the will found in Colonel Thorpe's luggage. Each incident had been a calculated move, designed to sow chaos and obscure a motive rooted in the Harrow family's past. Tonight, Miss Marple knew the truth would be unmasked. Lady Beatrice Harrow had gathered the remaining guest, Sclera Vane, Colonel Reginald Thorpe, and Margaret Llewellyn, the drawing room. Her cameo pinned to her dress, a silent reminder of the mysteries that had plagued her home. Elsie, the maid, served sherry with a quiet intensity, her eyes darting between the guests. The police, led by Inspector Hargrove, were present, stationed discreetly by the door, summoned by Miss Marple's discreet request that afternoon. Atmosphere was taut, each guest aware that the manor secrets could no longer be contained. Miss Marple rose, her frail figure commanding the room with quiet authority. "We have endured a series of tragedies," she began, her voice steady, "but they are not random. They form a pattern, one I believe we can now unravel." Clara, in a sapphire gown, raised an eyebrow, her mask of nonchalance slipping. "A pattern, Miss Marple. You sound like a detective in one of my plays." Thorpe, his monocle glinting, shifted uncomfortably. "Get to the point, ma'am. If you know something, out with it." Margaret, pale and silent, clutched her hands, her eyes fixed on Miss Marple, as if bracing for a blow. Beatrice, seated by the fire, nodded encouragingly, her trust in her friend absolute. Miss Marple began with the first night. Clara's scream in the library was no mere prank. It drew our attention to a toxicology book, open to a page on belladonna, planting the seed of poison in our minds. "The cameo's theft," she continued, glancing at Beatrice, "was meant to sow distrust, but its hiding in a vase suggested the thief wanted it found to keep suspicion alive." Clara's smile was tight. "You give me too much credit, Miss Marple. I'm an actress, not a mastermind." Miss Marple continued, undeterred. "Lionel's death in the locked study was staged as suicide, but the scratched lock and unfinished letter pointed to murder. The poisoned tea laced with tansy was a warning, not a fatal blow meant to frighten us. The threatening note at the masquerade, written by Margaret, was her attempt to protect me after overhearing a plot." Margaret's voice trembled. "I told you I didn't know who it was. I only wanted to keep you safe." Miss Marple nodded. "I believe you, my dear. But the hidden passage in the library, leading to letters about a disputed inheritance, revealed a motive. And the will, stolen from the safe and planted in Colonel Thorpe's luggage, was meant to frame him, diverting attention from the true culprit." Thorpe's face reddened. "I told you I was framed. I've no interest in Harrow's fortune." Beatrice clutched her cameo, her voice breaking. "Then who, Jane? Who's done all this?" Miss Marple's eyes settled on Elsie, who stood frozen, a tray of glasses trembling in her hands. "Elsie, my dear, you've been very quiet, but you've seen everything, haven't you? And you've done more than serve tea." Elsie's face paled, the tray clattering to the floor. I don't know what you mean, ma'am." Miss Marple's tone was gentle but firm. "You are not merely a maid, are you? The letters in the attic spoke of a hidden heir, a child of Eleanor, Sir Henry's cousin. You are that heir, Elsie, excluded from the Harrow fortune. You came to Blackthorn Manor not to serve, but to reclaim what you believe is yours." The room erupted in gasps. Clara's hand flew to her mouth. Thorpe's monocle dropped, and Margaret stared, wide-eyed. Beatrice rose, her voice shaking. "Elsie, my niece." Miss Marple continued. "You knew the manor's secrets, the passage, the safe's combination, the jewelry box's catch. You staged the cameo's theft to unsettle Beatrice, testing her resolve. You used the passage to enter the study, killing Lionel, who suspected your identity and planned to expose you. The poison tea was your warning to us all, and the will's theft was to secure your claim, framing Thorpe to buy time." Elsie's eyes filled with tears, but her voice was defiant. "You can't prove it. I'm just a maid." Miss Marple produced the letter from the attic, its ink faded but clear. "This name's Eleanor's child, born out of wedlock, raised in obscurity. Your knowledge of the manor, your access to the tea tin, and the footprint in the attic too. Small for a man's boot, but fitting your own betray you. The toxicology book was your guide, its pages marked by your hand." Hargrove stepped forward, his expression grim. "Miss Marple, that's a bold claim. Have you evidence?" Miss Marple gestured to her reticule, where she'd kept a scrap of fabric found in the passage, a piece of Elsie's apron, torn during her hurried movements. "This was caught in the passage door, and the tea tin, Inspector, will bear traces of tansy you'll find in Elsie's room, hidden among her belongings." Elsie's composure cracked, her voice rising. "I had to do it. They took everything from my mother, her name, her future. I grew up with nothing, while they lived in this grand house. Lionel found out, threatened to tell Beatrice. I couldn't let him ruin it." Beatrice staggered, clutching the arm of a chair. "Elsie, why didn't you come to me? I'd have helped you." Elsie's tears fell freely now. "You'd have pitied me, not accepted me. I wanted what was mine." She lunged for the door, but Hargrove was quicker, restraining her gently as she sobbed. Miss Marple's expression softened. "You sought justice, Elsie, but your methods were cruel. Lionel's death, the poison, the thefts, they were your revenge, but they've only brought more pain." Clara, her voice hushed, broke the silence. "All this for an inheritance. It's tragic." Thorpe, his bluster gone, nodded. "Poor girl. Greed and resentment make monsters of us all." Margaret, tears streaming, spoke softly. "I suspected something, but I couldn't believe it. Lionel mentioned a secret heir, but I thought he was mistaken." Beatrice approached Elsie, her eyes filled with sorrow. "You're my family, Elsie. I wish you'd trusted me. We could have found a way." Hargrove led Elsie away, promising a fair investigation, but the evidence, Miss Marple's meticulous deductions, the attic letters, the passages, clues overwhelming. The drawing room fell silent, the weight of the truth settling over the guests like dust. Miss Marple took Beatrice's hand. "You've been through a storm, my dear, but it's over now. The manor is yours again, and you can heal." Beatrice's voice was barely a whisper. "I'll try, Jane. For Elsie's sake, I'll see she's treated fairly. She's still my niece, whatever she's done." As the guests dispersed, Clara to pack, Thorpe to the terrace, and Margaret to her room, Miss Marple lingered with Beatrice. By the fire. "You've given me back my home, Jane," Beatrice said. "How can I thank you?" "By living well," Miss Marple replied. "And perhaps tending those roses in the garden. They need a firm hand, like you." The next morning, Miss Marple prepared to depart, her suitcase packed, her work done. The police had taken Elsie into custody, and the will now returned to Beatrice confirmed a small provision for Eleanor's child, which Beatrice vowed to honor legally. Clara, subdued, offered a quiet farewell, her theatrics replaced by genuine respect. Thorpe, gruff but grateful, shook her hand, admitting she'd outdone his military strategies. Margaret, still grieving, promised to visit St. Mary Mead, seeking Miss Marple's quiet wisdom as the car carried her away from Blackthorn Manor. Miss Marple gazed at the receding towers, their stones no longer shadowed by deceit. The mystery scream, cameo, murder, poison, note, passage, and will had been pieces of Elsie's desperate bid for retribution, each act a cry from a wounded past. The truth had prevailed, as it always did, and Miss Marple felt a quiet satisfaction. Blackthorn Manor was at peace, its secrets laid bare, and she was ready for the next puzzle life might bring.